You can support In the Past Lane with as little as $1 a month. Just go to the support page at our website, inthepastlane.com. Thanks. In 1967, in response to a long history of police violence against African Americans, members of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, formed armed patrols to monitor the police. At the time, this was perfectly legal, as California law allowed citizens to carry loaded weapons in public. But this initiative freaked out many white conservative members of the California state legislature. And so they passed a law banning the carrying of loaded weapons in public. And on July 28, 1967, Governor Ronald Reagan signed it into law. Yep, there was a time not long ago when conservatives loved gun control. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody is free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi everyone, welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 163, in which we explore the history of the Second Amendment and what it says about gun control. We are brought to you by SBI, Snoring Beagle International, and come to you this week from the Smith & Wesson Studios, located in central Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our YouTube channel. Guiding us along, as always, is our charming and disarming executive producer, Lulu Spencer. So, what's happening in The Past Lane this week? Well, like many Americans, I'm horrified and outraged over the mass shootings in El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio. And I've decided that In the Past Lane needs to do a timely episode on the history of the Second Amendment, and in the process expose some of the key myths about what the framers of the Constitution had in mind regarding an individual's right to own a gun or rifle. And I know just the person to speak to, historian Saul Cornell. He's one of the leading scholars of the history of the Second Amendment. He's also a good friend of mine, as we are co-authors, along with Jennifer Keene, of a U.S. history textbook, Visions of America. So let's not waste any time in getting to that interview. Okay, people, no open carry on this trip, only open minds. So get ready. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. The Second Amendment to the Constitution was ratified on December 15, 1791, as part of the Bill of Rights. It reads, "A well-regulated militia, being essential to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." And here are two key things to know about the Second Amendment. First, it did not prohibit gun regulation. To the contrary, gun regulation increased in the United States after the Second Amendment was adopted. Second, for almost 200 years, the meaning and the interpretation of the Second Amendment was clear and largely unchanged. It did not confer an absolute right to individuals to keep and bear arms. Rather, it was widely understood by judges and the public at large that the amendment concerned state militias. But then, in the 1970s, for reasons hinted at in this episode's Cold Open about the Black Panthers in California, a new and fundamentally different interpretation of the Second Amendment was crafted and popularized by groups like the NRA. It's this new interpretation that we've been living with for the past 50 years. Now, I point this out to emphasize a crucial historical truth. No document, institution, tradition, or symbol has a meaning that's frozen for all time. Their meaning and significance is always changing. Consider how marriage, long defined as the union of a man and a woman, has changed so dramatically in recent years. Consider also the dramatic shift in how many Americans view Confederate monuments and the Confederate battle flag. And the same is true of the Constitution. The words of the First Amendment have not changed since 1791. But our current understanding of free speech dates back to the 1920s, only about 100 years ago. people find it comforting to think of core documents, institutions, traditions, and symbols as possessing an essential and unchanging meaning. But honestly, that's a fantasy. When it comes to the Constitution, that fantasy is called originalism or textualism. It argues that there's a single, original, and unchanging interpretation of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Now, I'll spare you my full historian's rant against originalism here, but if you want the full treatment, you should check out In the Past Lane episode 94, where I speak with historian Andrew Shankman about his book Original Intents, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, and the American Founding. In the meantime, with me now is historian Saul Cornell. He is a professor of history at Fordham University and a leading scholar on early American history, especially the Anti-Federalists and the Second Amendment. He is the author of The Other Founders, Anti-Federalism and the Dissenting Tradition in America, 1788 to 1828. Also, A Well-Regulated Militia, The Founding Fathers and the Origins of Gun Control in America. And whose right to bear arms did the Second Amendment protect? In the course of our conversation, Saul Cornell discusses the key popular myths about the Second Amendment, namely that, number one, it was intended to allow citizens to resist and overthrow their government by force of arms, and number two, that it was fundamentally intended to protect an individual's right to bear arms. Why the framers of the Constitution were chiefly concerned about the need for strong state militias, not individual gun owners. How gun regulation in the late 18th and early 19th century was both extensive and intrusive. And how some of this regulation was based on a widely shared value among the framers of the Constitution, the right of the citizenry to a peaceful society. How the interpretation of the Second Amendment underwent a radical transformation in the 1970s, one that emphasized a libertarian claim to a near absolute right of an individual to possess and bear arms. And finally, an assessment of the current state of the gun control movement. Saul Cornell, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Well, thank you for having me.
As a historian, you bring a key insight to the Second Amendment debate that emphasizes the history and historical context in which it originated in the late 18th century. And this is important because the popular understanding of the Second Amendment is shaped by a lot of myths and popular culture. So I think our listeners would benefit from kind of an overview from you on what those myths are and what are those misrepresentations that really kind of distort the debate.
Well, that's a great place to begin because it's almost impossible to talk about the Second Amendment today without running straight into this veritable fog of mythology. So among the myths that cloud this debate are, for instance, the idea that the Second Amendment is part of some right of revolution,
right,
that basically private citizens have to have the kind of guns that are needed to take on the federal government to vindicate their liberty and overthrow tyranny. The only problem with that is, of course, there's only one crime that's defined in the Constitution, and that's treason. And treason, of course, is defined as taking up arms against the Constitution.
Right.
That sort of Red Dawn mythology, as I like to call it, because it's beautifully captured in the movie Red Dawn. Of course, the canonical Patrick Swayze Red Dawn, not the remake. That Red Dawn mythology really takes the vision of Daniel Shays and the rebels who took up arms against the government of Massachusetts in Shays' Rebellion as if they, not James Madison, who, of course, was sitting in Congress and helping to write the Second Amendment, it takes the view of the people who actually frighten the Founding Fathers and makes it the view that determines what the Second Amendment means. So that's just a very, even if you believe in originalism, you know, the idea that the Constitution should be interpreted according to its original meaning, which of course is a controversial theory of constitutional interpretation. It's certainly not the only theory of constitutional interpretation. But it would be odd if we decided to interpret the Constitution from the one group who the founders believed were the greatest threat to the Republic. So that set of myths about, you know, we need to have Stinger missiles, or at a very minimum, we all need to have machine guns, that's one set of myths. The other set of myths is the Founding Fathers were primarily, or I suppose we should say the founders, because we don't want to slight Mercy Otis Warren and a few of the other women who took an active role in the debate over the Constitution. So the other myth is that having a Glock in your bedside table stand so that you can blow away anyone who invades your home, that's what they were thinking about. Well, of course, that doesn't make much sense either, because there were relatively low rates of interpersonal violence, and there were very few handguns in 18th century America. They were predominantly weapons that the well-to-do would have.
People like Hamilton.
Yes, thinking of Hamilton and duels. And generally speaking, you were best off grabbing the nearest 2x4 or hitting someone with your musket rather than taking the time to load it, prime it, and fire it if indeed somebody was breaking into your house. So not to say that the founders didn't believe in the right of self-defense, which was well established under English common law, but the idea that our fears about, people coming into our houses to take our things and attack us, that really wasn't much on their minds because they lived in these very different societies. They lived in these rural societies that were face-to-face communities. They knew most people in their community. These were agricultural communities where you didn't have nearly as much free time, and also people couldn't move anonymously into these communities without being noticed. So most of the fears that we have today that inspire people to buy firearms have almost nothing to do with the kinds of fears that were driving the debate in the 18th century.
Right. A very different set of concerns. And some of the most recent writing you've done touches on this. You wrote a piece very recently in the wake of the most recent shootings in the New Republic, in which you write very succinctly, quote, "The great irony that modern champions of the Second Amendment have never appreciated is that adhering to the founders' actual vision of the Second Amendment would mean much more extensive and intrusive regulation of guns, not less." So maybe we could move on to that. It's clear that it's not a declaration, intended to allow people to overthrow their government, and it's not intended for individuals to be heavily armed against intruders. But let's move on to what it actually was about. It says quite clearly a well-regulated militia. Tell us, sort of what the intent of the amendment was in its context, and then also what happened afterward, the fact that gun regulation was very apparent in the early republic.
So, of course, today we sort of think that the great fear of gun rights advocates is registration. Of course, without some means of knowing who had weapons and in what condition they were, you couldn't muster a well-regulated militia. So one of the main driving forces behind modern gun rights ideology is totally at odds to the vision that made a well-regulated militia possible in the 18th century. Government had to keep track of who had guns. They had to keep track of what condition those guns were in. You could be fined for not showing up to muster with a kind of gun the government wanted you to buy, not the gun that you felt was most useful. I mean, that's another great irony is that, today people want these military-style weapons, AR-15 type weapons. But, of course, the big problem that drove much gun policy in the 18th century is that Americans didn't want to buy military weapons. They wanted to buy weapons that were useful for shooting critters that were eating your crops and killing turkeys so you could have dinner. So the idea that somehow people just showed up to the militia with whatever weapon they had, that it was just a bunch of private citizens getting together on the weekend and fighting professional armies and defending liberty, I mean, that mythology is just not what was true. Basically, these well-regulated militias were state entities. They were highly regulated. The militia statutes that define what the militia is, what kind of weapon you need, what happens if you don't bring your weapon to muster, these were among the longest laws that you can find on the 18th century law books. So, again, it was a vision not of individuals sort of atomistically gathering together, but it's all part of this early American agrarian rural society where the militia actually functions. I mean, there were no police forces. There's not much of a standing army until the American Revolution requires America to create one. And so, therefore, the militia is functioning to keep the peace, to put down slave rebellions in the South, to put down agrarian insurrections in the North. But it's also a little bit of like the Rotary Club and the Boy Scouts all rolled into one because it's one of the central building blocks of society. So that people participating in the militia, at least men participating in the militia, becomes a way to participate in local governance and becomes a way to cement the community together. So that whole side of it, again, has been completely eroded and lost. But it's precisely because the militia was a building block of community that you could keep an eye on who had guns and you could sort of spot if someone was acting a bit strange. The idea that you could just sort of drive across the state line, go to Nevada, buy a very deadly weapon, bring it back to your home community. I mean, that's just not anything that the founders could have anticipated because they lived in these very different kinds of communities.
Right. And you touched on it, but let's go a little further on that. The idea that the Second Amendment is not this ultra-individualist, libertarian part of the Constitution. it actually very clearly implies a collective enterprise, a collective goal, which is, to quote it, the security of a free state. So we, the people, need to collectively achieve the security of a free state. And that's a very different reading than from what people see today.
Well, of course. I mean, it bears some analogy to the jury because, of course, you can't just go out and collect 12 people and say, we're a jury and we're going to start trying cases. You have to go through a legal process that gives the jury its legal legitimacy as an institution. So similarly, both institutions are made up of individuals, and in that sense, it's an individual right because it's a right that starts in the individual, but it's an individual right that is understood to have a very, very strong and important collective function that's absolutely essential to the preservation of freedom and to the preservation of a republican form of government. So, again, this very hyper-individualistic libertarian view that we've developed is quite at odds with the dominant views in the 18th century. In fact, one great historian, David Hackett Fisher, in describing the world of Paul Revere and that sort of world that the Minutemen idea gives us, I mean, he said essentially, although it's perhaps slightly overstated, but there's a profound truth, that we tend to think of rights today as individual rights and collective responsibilities. Mm-hmm. In a real sense, many ideas about rights in the 18th century viewed them more as collective rights and, of course, tied to individual responsibilities. So it's almost the mirror image of the way we tend to talk about rights today.
Yeah, very interesting. And another thing closely related to that you develop in this most recent piece in the New Republic is this idea of a right to peace. That this is, we tend to think of rights in the negative sense, like the government can't, the government shall not, and in this case, regulate guns. But there's another side of liberty that we've sort of lost track of in our modern times, some of it driven by, the latest sort of resurgence of libertarianism and such. But the idea that there's a collective right to peace, that you have the right as a citizen to live in a peaceful society, and that there are people in the early republic specifically charged with that, known as justices of the peace. So maybe tell us a little bit more about that notion that seems to be lost in the debate.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that is really one of the most profound differences about the way we think about the Second Amendment and regulation and the past, is that we basically only focus on those ideas that sort of have survived and have lost touch with a lot of the ideas that were essential to the implementation of those ideas of liberty. And the peace is one of the most important, and it's a central concept in English common law. In fact, the great commentator on the common law, Sir William Blackstone, whose interpretations of English law are well known to the founding generation, says the peace is the fundamental core concept of the entire common law, that really what the law strives to do is to secure the peace. And starting in the era of Edward III in 14th century, you have the creation of the office of the Justice of the Peace, whose job it is to conserve the king's peace. Of course, after the revolution, we don't conserve the king's peace, we now conserve the people's peace. But the institution of the Justice of the Peace was absolutely essential, and they have enormous powers. And remember, they're a local officer. They're not a sort of representative of some distant government. They are your neighbor, and they're typically your sort of well-to-do, respected neighbor, hopefully, because one of the most important ways that they enforce the peace is to use their authority and their prestige and the fact that they are probably doling out some patronage and they are helping you in times of need. So again, it's tied into this notion of community. But those justices of the peace have the power to preemptively disarm anyone who poses a threat to the peace. And any individual in that community could approach a justice of the peace and ask someone to have to post what's called a peace bond, which is to put up a considerable amount of money. And that money was supposed to guarantee that they would not threaten the peace. And you lose the bond if you do something that threatens the peace, and a higher bond is imposed. And basically this process continues, or you get thrown in jail for violating your peace bond ultimately. But again, it's a way of keeping people responsible, of actually having some way to enforce the peace. And we've lost touch with that side of our history, although there's some sense that some of these new red flag laws, which give family and friends the ability to temporarily remove a firearm from a situation in which a person may do harm to themselves or others, that is the logical and in some case the legal descendant of this original concept, although as is appropriate, our notion of having these extreme violence protection orders includes much greater attention to due process. And again, it's important to note that the notion of due process that they involve is very similar to the kind of due process we use when you get a search warrant. So if you think about it, our whole criminal justice system would collapse if you had to have a trial before you could even gather evidence. Instead, what we have is a legal proceeding where the government presents probable cause, a judge reviews that probable cause, and then a warrant is issued. And that allows you to temporarily remove evidence before it can be destroyed or hidden. And the same thing applies to guns. So you sometimes hear that red flag laws don't provide due process. Well, they provide the same kind of due process that we use when issuing warrants. And if we were to deny that kind of due process, basically our whole criminal justice system would collapse because we couldn't prosecute any crime, right? Because if you couldn't get a warrant, how would we do any kind of law enforcement?
Right. I mean, I think it's that sort of absence of the wider context in so many different ways that leads to these kind of simplistic understandings of the Second Amendment. And you know, the other thing that's interesting about the long history of the Second Amendment is that really it was one of the least talked about, least discussed, least referred to amendments well into the 20th century. There are a couple of cases, but it's the current kind of radical individualist model of or understanding of the amendment is of relatively recent vintage. You know, so when you hear a politician who comes out and says he's going to block any background check legislation because he believes in the Second Amendment, what he really means is, I believe in a very recent, say 40, 45-year-old interpretation of the Second Amendment that was drummed up by the gun lobby to a large degree and then really marketed by them so that it's now become a mainstream idea. Tell us a little bit more about that, kind of the more recent history of how the Second Amendment has become this new thing.
Well, that's another really important point, that what we think of as the Second Amendment is a relatively recent creation, and it is a creation of a gun rights community and the gun industry. And I once spent a whole afternoon reading through the American Rifleman, one of the main publications of the National Rifle Association from the 1950s, and there's nary a mention of the Second Amendment. So that what the Second Amendment that we know is something that happens after the tumult of the 60s.
Yeah.
And of course, part of that has a lot to do with race relations in America and social dislocation and all kinds of other forces of rapid social change and instability. And during that period, you see the Second Amendment weaponized. Literally, its meaning morphs from the image of well-regulated militia, understood as this communal institution that is composed of individuals, to this hyper-individualistic notion of the right to bear arms, which really codes more to Dirty Harry or Rambo or those other kinds of individuals who populate American popular culture that the great cultural historian Richard Slotkin has described, this idea of gunfighter nation, you know, that there are these figures who have this natural moral compass. They're sort of on the margins of society, and they use violence strategically and redemptively to sort of reset the system, always to sort of purge it of its corruption. And then, of course, they sort of wander off into the sunset like the Lone Ranger or Jason Bourne, and things can begin anew. I mean, that popular culture motif runs all the way back to James Fenimore Cooper, and it's been constantly reinvented for each new generation. You know, it's the Sam Spade film noir detective, it's Dirty Harry, it's Jason Bourne most recently. So
right, or it's even John Fogerty's pop hit from about 10 years ago, Gunslinger. Yeah,
I mean, this idea of the gunslinger or the gunfighter or just any of these figures which populate American popular culture, they all use violence redemptively. And that's why when Layman LaPierre says a good guy with a gun is the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun, we all sort of stop, because he's tapping into the most powerful mythic construct in American popular culture. I mean, you don't see movies about individuals with a great set of statistics who formulate a new set of sound policies that incrementally reduce marginal rates of gun violence to everyone's benefit. I mean, Matt Damon has not signed on to do that particular role yet.
Right. For understandable reason. I don't think even Matt Damon could get a film like that funded. Well, you know, obviously this is a fraught topic, and it becomes more so every time there is a mass shooting, or in the case of Dayton and El Paso, you know, twin mass shootings. What do you think? There's a lot of question about the future of the gun control effort, and it seems to me that more and more historians like you are diving into the debate, because really for a long time it's been left to political scientists and legal scholars who are fine people with, do really good work, but they don't have that historical sensibility and understanding of history. What do you see as the future of, or are you an optimist when it comes to saying that a more historically informed notion of the Second Amendment could be somehow mainstreamed and become an important part of the discourse?
Well, we're at a very interesting time in American history because if you look at Newtown, that essentially since Newtown, of course, we've had virtually nothing at the federal level because, of course, our federal government is a mess in every conceivable way. I mean, hardly anything gets done these days, and what tends to get done is usually destructive as opposed to constructive.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the state level, however, you see a very different story. You see basically America almost as if you were to pick a metaphor, tectonic plate shift, because essentially pro-gun states have made their laws looser, and states that have always had tighter gun restrictions have made them tighter. So essentially America is drifting in two opposite directions. There are probably more states that have loosened their laws, but if you adjust for population, since the states that have tightened them are generally states with greater populations, probably about half of America now, since Newtown, lives under a more stringent gun regulatory system, and half of America lives under a looser one. So that seems to be where we're going, and perhaps the one cause for potential optimism is if conservatives could actually recall that they were traditionally the great champions of federalism and leaving much regulation to the states instead of now wanting to pass, reciprocal concealed carry laws, which are just nutty if you think about it, because in most parts of America you don't need any range time to actually obtain a concealed weapons permit. And I don't know anyone who's a serious gun enthusiast and responsible gun owner who thinks it's a good idea to allow people without proper training to walk around the streets with firearms. And you certainly don't see it among most cops and most military veterans who know all too well that it takes a lot of training to get someone to be able to deal with a firearm safely, and particularly in a crowded situation or a situation where there are innocent bystanders and the rules of engagement are unclear and people don't wear uniforms to distinguish who are the good guys and the bad guys, that all of these things actually militate in the direction of having more stringent requirements for concealed carry permits, not less stringent requirements, which seems to be a direction that a lot of states are going in. So, if we could get conservatives to value some of the things they used to value, then perhaps we could stem the tide of that potentially dangerous trend. Although the one thing that does seem to be true is that people oftentimes talk about, gun laws don't work. Look at Chicago, look at Baltimore. But of course, both of those cities have the problem of living near pro-gun states where guns are easily purchased, and it doesn't take long to go to Indiana or to go to Virginia and purchase a firearm. And of course, it also doesn't address the fact that cities like Houston and Miami and New Orleans, which are in relatively libertarian-oriented states as far as gun regulations, have even higher per capita levels of gun violence. I mean, the body count in Chicago is higher, but Chicago is also a much larger city. If you adjust for size, Houston and New Orleans and Atlanta are probably more deadly than Chicago on any given weekend. So again, it's hard to think in a calm, deliberative manner about this because it touches so many cultural, political issues. It becomes a culture war issue. But the more that we can calm the debate down and the more that we can make it evidence-based as opposed to soundbite-based, I think we'll get better results.
I agree, and I certainly hope so. Well, Saul Cornell, this has been a great conversation, and I've learned a lot, and I think it's obviously a very timely one. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us at In the Pass Lane.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Saul Cornell is the author of A Well-Regulated Militia, The Founding Fathers and the Origins of Gun Control, published by Oxford University Press and available wherever books are sold. If you like this episode, you can show your appreciation by purchasing some of our merchandise. We've got all sorts of history-themed t-shirts, like Historians Against History Repeating Itself, which also comes in many variations like History Majors and History Students and History Teachers Against History Repeating Itself. And we've got some great history quote t-shirts like this one by Confucius, Study the Past if you would define the future, and one featuring an African proverb, Until the lions have their historians, tales of the hunt shall always glorify the hunter. And there's lots more. Just go to inthepasslane.com and click on merchandise. Thanks. Okay, Pass Laners, as always, this has been a lot of fun. But alas, we are out of time. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to this podcast at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. And please leave a starred review. And tell your friends about In the Past Lane. Thanks. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey, Lulu, what's your biggest challenge as executive producer of this podcast?
Summoning the will to get out of bed each morning.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.